That's pretty... Huh? Look at us super go, baby. Oh, we killed him before I even got my second super. Lately, there's been a lot of talk on the game about super regen, with Bungie updating the roaming super changes to where you get your supers much faster. I thought it'd be a fun idea to bring back one of the OGs in super regen builds, and one that you can actually use soon in the future for the new dungeon that's going to launch in February, because the way things are going, solo dungeon runs are now going to consist of you trying to pepper in damage that could be passive on bosses, rather than just pelting them with ammo during damage phases, and this build is perfect for that. So without further ado, here is the Scorching Hot DPS build. Now this can be ran in two different ways. We're going to talk about Prismatic later, but for now we're going to stick with the main version of this, which is going to be on Solar Hunter, just straight up Solar Hunter, and we're going to be utilizing the Blade Barrage super rather than Golden Gun. And for our exotics in this build, we're going to utilize Dragon's Breath, as you saw in the opening clips, and the exotic armor piece of choice is going to be Shards of Galanor. The idea of the build is two things. One, crowd control as much as you can, and two, get as many supers off as humanly possible while doing passive damage if you're fighting bosses. This build does both of those things perfectly. Thanks to Shards of Galanor, as long as you hit your super and most of your knives either hit a group of enemies or some strong yellow bars, you will get super refunded back to you, and typically it'll be 50% back. Then Dragon's Breath is used to just crowd control and blow up everything in sight, or fire a Dragon's Breath rocket at a boss and watch it ignite the boss multiple times. And as a lot of you already know, ignitions are some of the best ways to get back chunks of super energy very quickly for you to get a new super back. But that's not all Dragon's Breath does. While it does ignite enemies over and over time it also replenishes its own fuel, and once that fuel hits the full meter bar, it gives you ammo back into your Dragon's Breath. This allows you to fire a rocket at a boss and to swap to different weapons to do damage with those weapons while you're igniting the target. This also includes using other weapons to scorch the target to get the scorch to max out faster and cause an ignition. Or ideally, you start peppering shots on the boss with your other two weapons, and then go back to Dragon's Breath once it's auto-reloaded itself thanks to its fuel, and then fire off another rocket to get some more ignitions off. The beauty about how super bars feel these days in PvE content in Destiny is that the more shots you fire at a boss with your weapons or damage over time, the faster your super comes back. This includes things like Wither Horde or Aerial Denial GLs and so on. So because of this, I opted to do two of these kinds of weapons with this build just to try to get my super back as fast as I can. Now for my energy weapon, I ended up going with a Solar Sniper, Icolo Sniper to be exact. The reason for this is to match the affinity of Dragon's Breath, so I can match the affinity for the surges in my boots just to maximize damage. Now I do want to note that if you wanted to use a different affinity sniper, let's say like an arc sniper, you could actually swap your boots to that surge affinity instead for arc, because Dragon's Breath damage, while technically speaking it does do impact damage, most of its damage will come from the ignitions, not actually weapon damage, so you don't need to worry about stacking 3 solar surges to maximize the damage of Dragon's Breath. Rather focus on your other 2 weapons for that. Now, as for my Icolo Sniper, the role I have on it is 4 times the Charm and Focus Fury. This is simply to just get out as many shots as I can while Dragon's Breath is reloading itself. So with 4 times the Charm, as one of the perks, I will keep landing rapid precision hits on my enemy and get 2 rounds back into the magazine, and typically I can get off a bunch of shots, like 10 plus on an enemy. Then I can swap back to Dragon's Breath, shoot it again, and then go back to Icolo Sniper or the kinetic slot weapon instead. Speaking of the kinetic slot, currently I have Lost Signal in this, mainly because it's episode 2 Revenant and Geos have a lot of utility currently this episode with concussive reload and weakening enemies and all of that. It's also an Aerial Denial GL, which means it does DOT, damage over time, on an enemy, so that also helps me get some super energy back. But I do want to say that it won't be mandatory once this episode's artifact mods go away and Heresy launches. I mean, who knows, Heresy might have GL mods again too. But you do not need to have a Lost Signal in this slot, and you can replace it with something else down the line. For example, if you wanted to run 2 snipers, you could run like Icolo Sniper plus Supremacy, and then Supremacy can have kinetic tremors and rewind rounds on it, so you can continuously get ammo back in both your snipers while swapping to Dragon's Breath when it auto-reloads, and just keep your damage going over time for as long as the damage phase lasts. And that's generally the weapon setup. You don't have to use the exact same weapons that I have, but typically you want something like this going for you with Dragon's Breath. And you'd be surprised how far this setup can take you. This does pretty damn solid damage overall. Now, is it going to contend with the best DPS in the game? No, not quite. I would say it would be in the A tier column, where the best of the best would be in S tier, but that's still nothing to scoff at. A tier is still pretty damn good. Now, this build does have one major downside, and that is if you have multiple people with an ignition-based build on your team fighting a boss, you're kind of going to be stealing damage from each other, so to speak. As a lot of you already know, ignitions in the game don't work on a player-to-player basis, meaning that if two different players are trying to pop off an ignition with, let's say, 2 conditional finalities, only one of you will get the ignition, the other person will not, and thus only one person will get the big chunky damage from the ignition. Therefore, what this build suffers from is just having multiple people trying to do ignitions on a fire team. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, the best results you're going to see in a damage phase with this build is going to be if you're the only person utilizing ignitions, or at least using Dragon's Breath and nobody else uses another copy of Dragon's Breath. Now let's get into abilities. First up, we have our dodge. This is going to be Marksman's Dodge. Pretty simple. You want to dodge to get a reload on your weapon. This typically would be for your snipers. Let's say you fire Dragon's Breath, you switch to a sniper, you fire off 7 shots, whatever sniper you may have. You then use Marksman's Dodge to get another 7 shots in, and then at that point you can go back to Dragon's Breath and fire another shot, which you would definitely have by now with the fuel reload. For your melee, you can use whatever knife you want. You can use Knife Trick, Proximity Knife, whatever fits your build. And then for your grenade, there's 2 choices to make, I feel like, here. Either A, you can go with Healing Grenade, just as a backup in a tight spot in an emergency, or you can go with Trip Mine Grenade, because that'll allow you to do a little bit of damage on whatever you stick, and also it'll scorch the target, which will help you get to an ignition faster for more damage. For the aspects, one specifically does matter more than the rest, and that's going to be Knock 'em Down, specifically because Knock 'em Down states that Blade Barrage launches more projectiles. The more projectiles you launch, the more damage you do, and obviously the more super energy you'll get back as well. Additionally, Knock 'em Down also helps you get free refunds on your melees, because when you're Radiant and you get a final blow with your equipped throwing knife, so let's say you just throw Knife Trick at a Dreg and you kill him, you will fully get refunded for your melee to get it back for another free use to get Radiant. Your other aspect could be either or. You can go with On Your Mark if you'd like, or you can go with Gunpowder Gamble, just to have another extra solar explosion going with the whole ignition theme in this build. Now onto your fragments. This is where all the juice comes from. We have 5 fragments here, and we're going to go from left to right. The first is going to be Ember of Ashes. You apply more Scorch stacks to targets. The faster and the more stacks of Scorch you apply to a target, the faster you get to your ignition, which does more damage. Next is going to be Ember of Eruption. This is kind of an optional one. This states your solar ignitions have increased area of effect. Basically, if you're using this in crowd control situations, this is really helpful. However, if you're going to be using this on a boss that's solo and by itself and no other targets are going to be around them, then you can swap this out for Ember of Singeing instead, which states your class ability recharges faster when you scorch targets. Basically, once you're continuously scorching a boss in a damage phase, you will get multiple dodges off, and multiple dodges mean you get multiple reloads for your Marksman's Dodge. Number 3 is going to be another optional fragment, Ember of Char. This is specifically for crowd control again. Your solar ignition spreads Scorch to affected targets. So if you're not in a situation with crowd control, and again, it's a solar boss, instead what you can swap this out for would be Ember of Imperium. Your solar weapons or ability final blows extend the duration of restoration and radiant effects applied to you. Number 4 is going to tie in with that, Ember of Solace, or Solace, I always forget how to say this. Radiant and restoration effects applied to you have an increased duration, so instead of like 4 seconds, you will now have 10, I believe, which is really helpful. And then lastly, Ember of Torches. Powered melee attacks against combatants make you and nearby allies radiant. So you throw your knife, you instantly become radiant, and you do more damage. Now, for a second, we're going to quickly pivot, because at the beginning of this, I did mention there's 2 different ways to run this build. The first one is the solar-based version. The second one is going to be the prismatic version. This version takes Golden Gun instead of Blade Barrage, and then applies your fan favorite Celestial Nighthawk to maximize damage. Now, you'd think this build probably does ignitions much less often and does less damage, right? Well, not quite. Let's explain. First off, you have the Transcendence Grenade in this version, where you can both shatter and ignite an enemy when you stick them with this grenade, which, when you have Prismatic, will be multiple times over, so you get free ignitions off of that alone. Then you can utilize the Shatter and Ignition system through your abilities and your fragments as well. You've got Snare Bomb to weaken an enemy, then you have Dust Shield before you throw your Prismatic Grenade to just freeze an enemy and eventually shatter them for some free damage. You also have Facet of Ruin, which is basically Ember of Eruption, but in Prismatic flavor, which helps with ignitions too. You've got Facet of Dawn, which is basically Torches, but Prismatic flavored. Facet of Command, which allows you to get basically a free weapon reload when you freeze an enemy, which means you get an extra reload besides just having your Marksman's Dodge to reload your snipers, which is always handy. You get bonus damage resistance from Facet of Protection. And then lastly, Facet of Courage allows you to have your light abilities do more damage when an enemy, in this case a boss, is affected by a darkness debuff, strand, or stasis, which I just mentioned a bunch of different ways you can apply stasis to a boss. The core concept does stay the same. You pop your super and then utilize Dragon's Breath and Ignitions and Freezes along with your other two weapons to get back a second super and then fire it once again. The only difference with this variant is that you have more utility and more specific combinations with bonus damage, but Celestial Nighthawk doesn't give you 50% of your super back when you hit a boss. Although I will say, Celestial Nighthawk does do more damage than Blade Barrage, so it kind of offsets each other, if that makes sense. But that's the build in a nutshell. If you like explosions, then this build will be right up your alley. I used this build in my Warlord's Ruin solo flawless, and if the next dungeon is anything like that and Heffen as the final boss, then I think this build will do just fine. As always, I will have a dim link in the description for the build if you want to try it out on your own, and if you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing today. It does help the channel grow and is much appreciated. And if you want to go the extra mile, you can leave a like and or a comment below as well. If you don't know what to leave as the comment, you can leave Dragon's Breath as the comment. Thanks for watching. Catch you next time.
Oh! It happened!